Yes, the topic is overwhelming topic, both for the speaker as well as for the audience. In fact, many of you must already be gearing up to listen to a very dense and boring presentation because it's too philosophical, unlike other technical or methodological sessions where you will get a little more illustrating kind of an experience. But here, the challenge is to talk philosophy without being too esoteric and boring. And paradigms. Paradigms, let me just quickly define it for the benefit of the audience. I'm not going to detain myself spending a lot of time there, but I'll just quickly elaborate on it. The usual suspect paradigm is an overarching philosophical system that contains three important elements within it, which are ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies. I'm deliberately pluralizing these words, even though classically one would call them as ontology, epistemology, and methodology. But this is the classic definition. It is also a kind of a belief system, an overarching kind of a worldview, or a belief system that attach a user to a particular worldview. So paradigms are a kind of a guidelines to live, particularly if you are a researcher, how to live yourself as a researcher is guided by certain kinds of broader worldview or broader guidelines. And this paradigm is a word that was actually, you all know, that was given by Thomas Kuhn. Even though he came from science, it had a lot of resonances for social sciences. But there is a fundamental difference between paradigm in natural sciences and paradigm in social science. A paradigm in natural science, as it was clearly elaborated by Kuhn, dies and a new paradigm emerges. So if you really look at the history of paradigms in natural sciences, they are very linear in nature and they are kind of replacing the earlier paradigms. They are not cumulative, but they are more linear in nature. So a paradigm that exists now will die and a new paradigm will emerge. And there is no question of multiple paradigms existing at one particular point in time in natural sciences. Whereas in social sciences, curiously, paradigms can exist in plurality. In social sciences, paradigms do not die. They only go into coma and they get resurrected again and again. The very paradigm that governed qualitative research was not something that came up all of a sudden fresh. It was something that existed even before, but it only got resurrected. It existed even in late part of 19th century, but it got resurrected in the middle of 20th century. And it might go back to coma again, which is probably one of my arguments in this paper, in this presentation. So in social sciences, paradigms circulate, paradigms gain currency, die, and again resurrect themselves. That's why we have a kind of a plurality of paradigms, and one can probably have the luxury in social science of adhering to many paradigms at one particular point in time. So this is basically about paradigm, and I just want to distinguish paradigms of social science from the paradigms of natural sciences. But I'm going to just slowly deviate from the classical narrative of paradigms in qualitative research. There is always a kind of a set beaten track or a kind of a trodden path for talking about paradigms in qualitative research. Normally one would talk about different paradigms, like starting from interpretive, positivist, post-positivist, interpretive, constructivist. That's the kind of a journey quite often people take, but this is a journey that you could probably familiarize yourself with any books or any presentations on qualitative research and paradigms in qualitative research. But here I'm not going to do that, since it's already a set path and available in myriad of literature available in either YouTube or in the form of books as well. So I'm going to just talk about a completely new set of challenges, a new set of paradigms, or I'm going to probably recognize the fact that we are going through a time in social science where there is a crisis of paradigms that govern qualitative research is happening. And this crisis is a brand new crisis, the crisis that is so close to us, the 21st century inhabitants. So this particular crisis must be accounted for and recognized before we really talk about the classic notions of paradigm. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And the classical paradigms, the classical notions and narrations of paradigms are being challenged dramatically by a realities, a new set of realities that are emerging around us. And those realities we'll try to get a sense of. So we all know that qualitative research has come a long, long way. In fact, the Department of Sociology in Kerala offering a webinar on that itself is a recognition of the fact that qualitative research frameworks and methodologies have really gained so much of recognition and have moved to the center stage from the margins that it occupied long time back. Even in many departments and centers in India, qualitative research may still be at a kind of a midway between periphery and center, but slowly it's gaining currency, it's moving into the center and getting acceptance globally as well as domestically and nationally as well. So this is not a kind of a joke. It happened because of a whole lot of challenges that qualitative frameworks and research faced and overcame as it moved from the periphery to the center. But those challenges that probably emerged in the 1980s, which we'll be probably elaborating later, are overcome by the qualitative research. But we are now moving into a time where new set of challenges are emerging, a new set of challenges, paradigmatic changes are emerging for qualitative research. And if you do not understand these new challenges to the paradigms, then you won't be able to understand the paradigms of the classical nature and variety. And some of the challenges that are right in front of us is very proximate, very close. One is a pandemic. The other one is the digitization of our social and the whole life, whether it's scientific or social lives. Our scientific realities and social realities, natural realities are getting extremely digitized. And we're also moving into a kind of a metaverse kind of a situation where our lives are broadly and largely conducted in digital spheres or cyber spheres or virtual spheres. Added to that is the biggest challenge of neoliberalism, which tries to set a new logic for organizing social life. These are all challenges that probably 80s qualitative researchers did not face. The interpretive communities of 1980s and 90s did not probably anticipate these challenges. And the classical narratives would be narrating the paradigms without probably taking cognizance of these challenges. And the time has come to take these challenges seriously. Another important emerging challenge is also the emerging indigenous paradigms, or the arrival, the assertive arrival of these indigenous paradigms that are emerging from decolonized societies like South American societies, India, China, Japan, Korea. These are also offering huge opportunities and challenges to new way of conceptualizing paradigms in social sciences that can govern qualitative research. And added to that further would be the feminist challenges, which also align themselves sometimes with the indigenous challenges. So these are biggest challenges that are right in front of us. And what these challenges do, what these new emerging realities do, they foundationally alter the very notions upon which qualitative research approaches or qualitative inquiries were built. So qualitative research was built on certain foundational notions, paradigmatic notions, which are increasingly being overturned and facing a mounting challenge from the newly emerging realities. And so-called revolutionary paradigms of the classical variety, 1980s, 90s varieties, are slowly losing their steam. In fact, some of the foundational notions like critical, emancipatory, praxis, rigor, research rigor, reflexivity, participatory research, agency, voice, self, these are some of the notions that got privileged during the 80s, 90s when qualitative research asserted its dominance over scientific and quantitative research and probably acquired a kind of a centrality in academic institutions and research centers. When they did that, they probably privileged these words like criticality, emancipatory, praxis, etc., etc. And these are the words that are again being challenged currently. And some of these words are losing their significance. Some of their words are getting unpacked in a completely different way, and some of them are being exiled also. That also we will see how they are happening. And in the background of all these things is also the emerging cry for social justice, because as we see around, a neoliberal kind of a society offers enormous amount of challenges, enormous amount of problems to the notions of social justice. Neoliberalism really raises a lot of questions about the role of poor and the role of women, role of marginalized communities in terms of how they are going to assert themselves and who is going to align with them, because they are being increasingly ignored and orphaned in neoliberal societies. The states are no longer at the center, discharging their welfare responsibilities. Neoliberal systems push the states to the margin, and with that, the poor and the marginalized are also pushing themselves, are getting pushed further to marginalization. And the researcher's responsibility, the social researcher's responsibility, particularly a qualitative researcher's responsibility, to address the concerns of these marginalized so that we can bring transformative social justice and also handhold with those marginalized communities in offering resistances against oppression, is also more acute than before. And this is offering a challenge also to the paradigms that we are going to hold, and what kind of a paradigm that we are going to celebrate and hold on to is a question that we need to address as well. Okay, so we are imagining a kind of a paradigm that is not just part of a craft called research, but also a paradigm that discharges social responsibilities of the researcher and the research institutions in terms of inspiring transformative inquiries in our researchers. Our researchers are going to be transformative inquiries, providing a moral authority to the research as well as to the research authorities or research institutions to move people to struggle and resist oppression and injustice if they are needed. It may be a tall order. You might be even wondering, people who have been trained in conventional research methodologies will be wondering why a researcher has to imagine himself or herself as a moral authority, as a transformative leader. Is research not an objective, neutral kind of an exercise? And that's what was challenged in 1990s, 2000, up to that period. It got challenged, and we are now no longer even debating it in a big way, because research is no longer objective. Research is acutely subjective experience altogether. So it's a critical kind of a subjectivity that we all have agreed, and critical subjectivity governs qualitative research as well. In fact, I would like to characterize this era as the era of post-postism. We are all celebrating globalization. We are all celebrating postmodernism as if we are all very much in the midst of it. We are very much caught in the throes of postmodernism, post-capitalism, and post-Marxism and all that. But actually speaking, we have even moved further, and we are now moving into a completely new era, an era that is characterized by post-interpretivism and post-materialism. In fact, qualitative research prides itself on the fact that it's an interpretive exercise, an interpretive discipline, not an explanatory discipline like science. And quantitative research is characterized by explanation, and qualitative research prides itself on saying that I'm interpreting the world and I'm not explaining the world. This interpretivism of qualitative research itself is being passed by. We are now moving into a kind of a post-interpretive phase where the challenges that are facing us are much more enormous than the challenges that we faced as qualitative researchers in 1990s and 2000. So this new set of post-postism, the post-interpretivism, post-materialism, they are all very much emerging on the horizon, and one has to account for them. One has to probably recognize their significance as well. And not only the old ones are becoming more of a passe, the old ones are going away, but also the new ones are emerging, which are sometimes hybrid in nature. And these new paradigms or new post-postisms are emerging as a result of new geographies of knowledge emerging. I already talked about the emergence of indigenous knowledge systems. Knowledge is which are trying to become more determining, but arising from the peripheries like South American societies, Korean societies, Japanese and Chinese societies, including Indian societies. They are trying to redefine and reconfigure knowledge itself. And these new knowledges and the geographies from which they are emerging, they're also resulting in a kind of a possibility of a hybrid knowledge system, hybrid paradigms, and decolonization of epistemology, because there is a self-conscious attempt on the part of us. For example, even this exercise I would like to call it as an exercise of decolonization as well. It is not, we are trying to talk about qualitative research as it was made and configured in Western institutions, and we are trying to slavishly adopt them. We are trying to adopt them so that we can also critically engage with them and decolonize it so that they become more applicable to our social reality. So decolonization of epistemologies and emerging geographies of knowledge both offer these hybridization of paradigms and hybridization of knowledge processes and knowledge making. And the pandemic, I already mentioned about it. The pandemic offers a very huge challenge. In fact, nobody expected pandemic would last this long, and we are now entering into kind of a new normal, and probably it will take time for us to get out of the impact that paradigm has created. But sometimes we may also have to completely reconfigure the way we do research and the way we relate to social realities. Here, the important challenge that qualitative research faces is the question of reassertion of science and data. What happened with pandemics is that actually you all very well know that today the society is not in the control, not under the control of qualitative researchers, but quantitative researchers, scientists. Scientism is the organizing principle. It decides when we can go out, when we cannot go out. Science decides whether we are going to have a social life or not. So we all at one point anticipated that qualitative research will be the determining agency, but pandemic completely up to the ante, and now we are in a situation where science seems to be in control of our social lives. But with that, we are also seeing the reassertions of the ontologies of counting, as I would like to call it, the ontologies of evidence-based, the ontologies of number. They are reasserting themselves as more and more people are using terminologies that are scientific in nature. So the quantitative and scientific methodologies are reasserting their dominance, and the qualitative research has to mount another war against this scientism, which it did in 1980s and 90s. It overcame the dominations of science only to probably return to the same war once again. And that challenge one has to recognize. So the scientism is a big challenge right in front of us, and the scientism accompanying themselves with the digital realities, the digital technologies, also produce a kind of a data dominance, a kind of an era of big data. That's what we are all part of. So on the one hand, a mounting scientism, an enormous, monstrous scientism on the one hand, on the other hand, big data. Both of them combine together to declare qualitative research as irrelevant. But is it really irrelevant? That's the question that we'll try to answer towards the end. So the qualitative research paradigms are facing the old struggles once again. In fact, the methodological struggles of 1970s and 80s are back in full force. And today, not only do we have a big science and big data in terms of one singular science, but also competing sciences themselves are emerging. The debate, the decades between 1980s and 2010s were the decades where science was also asking a lot of questions and was trying to reassert itself by donning different garbs, different dresses to itself, so that it can actually colonize the space that qualitative research has occupied. So science is very cleverly reasserting itself by assuming different names and different forms. For example, we are now talking about public science, which is saying I'm no longer elitist in nature. Qualitative science, which says I would like to ask a lot of questions about the quality as well, not just quantity. Post-human and post-materialist science, which says that I would like to go beyond humans. I would like to not just seek the welfare of humans, but also I would like to go beyond the human and talk about ecosystems and ecologies. Decolonized science, sciences that are practiced in third world, non-Western, southern hemisphere countries, which say that I can actually practice a science which is decolonized, so it can be a better science. Then, of course, feminized science or feminine science, there's a spelling mistake here. Feminine sciences. Feminists have also critiqued science and have feminized science, which is also trying to claim the same space that qualitative research is occupying. Some of them might use qualitative research, some of them might want to replace qualitative research. So today we are facing two important challenges from science. One, from the big science, re-privileged and re-glorified by pandemic, and multiple plural sciences which are critically engaged with by all kinds of marginalized communities, women, indigenous communities, non-elites, qualitative researchers, all have also engaged themselves with science and have reconfigured science in such a way that it is trying to claim the same space that qualitative research is occupying. Some might even wonder, why do we have to do qualitative research when we have sensitive sciences themselves? And that's a big paradigmatic change that we have in front of us. So we are living in a time when there are no more monolithic science, not one singular science, but multiple sciences. I will also dwell a little bit upon the other important point, which I only hinted in the previous slides, the question of pandemic and neoliberalism and digitalism. So today, technological rationality, the very basis, the foundation of science, is trying to replace the qualitative notion of interpretivism, the qualitative notion of interpretative paradigms. So the technological rationality is re-privileging words like audit, accuracy, efficiency, testing, we all know as part of pandemic, evidence, prediction. As we are all going through this dark phase of pandemics, how much of science we are beginning to engage ourselves with, how much of science which make also sense to us, how much of science that governs our social interactions and behavior, and suddenly the old words of meaning, old words of voice, old words of agency are losing their currency, and old the scientifically tempered words like audit, accuracy, efficiency, testing, evidence, prediction, they are reasserting themselves. And neoliberalism, as it is so obsessed with the marketizing society, it wants knowledge workers. As it pushes non-knowledge workers to the periphery, knowledge workers are needed. These knowledge workers are nearly automatons, and the most privileged professionals of our current times in the last 20 years, 2 decades have been these knowledge workers, the IT professionals and data analysts. And they are the extremely glorified and extremely over-celebrated professionals. And qualitative researchers are at the margins because of the excessive privileging of these knowledge workers. So they are the figureheads of our current times, and where do we place these qualitative researchers? So it is very, many of you are young students, it may be very interesting. How are you going to relate yourself to qualitative research, which probably look less attractive than becoming a knowledge worker? So we have to probably compete with knowledge workers as the most prestigious, most attractive, and most wanted, and most eligible people in comparison to these qualitative researchers. So that's again a big challenge. Even people who do social science research would like to do research as if they are engaged in big data analysis, as if they are stylizing themselves as knowledge workers. So that's a big challenge. So in this particular time, the data analytic workers and algorithm-based assessment of human and social realities are also gaining currency. We all know how the big data is the reason why we buy certain things, why certain things are coming onto your phone, why we spread certain kinds of information, why we design ourselves using all kinds of beautification app, how we redefine our own selves. All these things are being made possible by all kinds of data and algorithms, which provides a new space, a social space where human and machine interactions are assuming enormous amount of significance. Humans are no longer separable from the machines with which they are interacting, and they shape machines as much as machines shape them. Here I'm talking about laptops, to cars, automated cars. We're talking about mobile phones. So mobile phones define even our body posture. So there's a huge human-machine interactions which probably the pre-digital age qualitative research did not anticipate. And artificial intelligence and machine learning are continuously intertwining themselves into our lives on a day-to-day basis, privileging data, number, and quantity rather than quality. So it is in that background, I would like to talk about 5 important paradigms that we go through as we move from the pre-classical positivist stage where quantitative research was dominant to the current times. If you want to really track the journey of paradigms in qualitative research, then one has to track it in these terms rather than in the classical terms. So let me just quickly elaborate on the paths, the various milestones that the paradigms of qualitative research traveled until today. And if I probably not talked about it, and if I just would kind of confined myself to talking about the classical narratives of paradigm, I would be probably missing 2 decades of experience that happened after 2000 when the new millennium was born. So the first one was positivism, which we all know, where the natural science methods were also transported to social science methods, and people thought that the reality is very much out there for us to access using scientific methods and technologies, techniques and tools. So it is very much possible, like science, that the existing external reality is very much out there. It is not influenced by our emotions. They are very much there and we can study them. Many of us even now think our research is basically guided by positivism, or without even recognizing, we think we are doing sensitive research, but we don't recognize the fact that our research is guided by positivism. And we are still living in pre-classical days, almost like the birth of the previous millennium, 20th century, not the 21st century, to the time that probably was the glorified period of science until 1960s in social sciences. So positivism is the guiding principle until 1970s, when nobody questioned, or the questioning people were margins, at the margins of social science communities, and positivism was the reigning principle around that time. Then the challenge came from qualitative researchers and social scientists who talked very firmly and very vocally about separating social science kind of research from natural science kind of research, and saying that natural science methodologies and methods cannot be applied to social sciences, because social sciences are dealing with a completely distinct reality, and the people who are involved in it are not exactly like chemicals and material things that they need interpretation. And they themselves are continuously interpreting people. The ordinary people are continuously interpreting people. So these interpreting people cannot be subjected to explanation like we explain data derived out of material or natural world. Then came the critical approach. This approach further critiqued both science as well as interpretivism, saying that we need to be much more skeptical, much more critical in our engagement, rather than simply very naive and trusting of social realities. Constructivism, we need to question that very strongly. So critical theory of the Frankfurt also guided social sciences in terms of asking questions which will help people to emancipate themselves. So the role of sociologists and social scientists when they do research is not just to interpret the world, but also to change the world. So if one were to use a Marxian metaphor, the previous Marx would say that the classical sociologists were so busy explaining the world, but the time has come to change the world. So what the second wave of qualitative researchers were doing, and what qualitative researchers were doing at the second stage, was more of interpreting the world by departing from explanation of the world. But critical school said, no, we don't need to just interpret the world, but also we need to think of changing the world through a process called praxis, where action research and certain other participatory research became much more important. Then came the post-structural stage, which were probably happening between 1980s and 2000, where the very edifice of society was questioned. The foundational notions upon which even classical social research was built was questioned. The very idea that human is a unique, producing, signifying entity is no longer there. Humans are not there. Humans are themselves a product of society, and humans are not producers of knowledge. Humans are not producers of society, but society and knowledge produces, they produce human beings. So human beings themselves are a product, not a producer. That was something that challenged the very foundational notion, and very curiously and intriguingly, it resulted in the emergence of post-positivism within social science. So people believed, yes, it is very much possible that we cannot explain the world, but let us try as much as possible to go closer to that explanation, because society and realities are very much out there constructing us rather than we constructing them. So that was post-structural kind of a world. Then came the current challenge, the ontological challenge, the post-interpretivism and post-materialism, which also carry along themselves the notion of post-human and post-social. Particularly in a time when we are caught in the vortex of digitalism, the very notion of social itself is undergoing change. If post-structuralism questioned the very notion of human and heralded the moment of post-human, digitalism is producing, neoliberalism and digitalism is producing a new notion of social. Today our social is very pluralized. Social is so unpacked and opened up in such a way that the social includes animals, social includes machines, social includes data. We all are continuously being produced by all the elements, not just human to human. Earlier we thought social involves only humans, but today in many German and Japanese societies where old age people are living alone, they are interacting on a day-to-day basis with pet animals. And pet animals are becoming part of social. They give them memories, they give them relationships. And people are also relating nowadays to artificial intelligence. And even some of them are even trying to marry. We also heard about a movie called Her, where a person is trying to marry Siri, the Apple's artificial intelligence assistants. And people today are talking more to Alexa, Siri, Google Assistants than probably to another human being. Our social interactions are becoming more post-social. Today, I'm talking to you and I'm going to tell someone tomorrow that I spoke to a group of students in Trivandrum or various parts of Kerala without ever having even met them. And we do have some kind of a social relationship today. These are all new challenges that are emerging. So qualitative research have to raise themselves to these challenges, but also have to account for the new kind of paradigms that are emerging. So that's the paradigm that we would have missed if you have not focused on the whole trajectory that qualitative research paradigms passed through. So post-social is a very, very important thing. And we are also talking about feminism, post-coloniality, transnational, multiple realities, including social and digital realities, all made possible by digital technologies and new forms of knowledge and inquiry. So this is the paradigm that we have come to occupy or come to be influenced by now. This is the paradigm that's around us, but we have not really accounted for it. We have not really got much sense and hang of this new paradigm. And this new paradigm is how this paradigm is the one that's governing our contemporary research. But very often we end up doing research, social research, which are still under the influence of older paradigms, as if new paradigms did not emerge or new challenges did not emerge. So the new ontologies, the ontological paradigm of today itself is something that we need to engage with and unpack and try to deconstruct and see what are the different tendencies within them. So I will just kind of elaborate on the colonial, the ontological paradigm, the last paradigm, which I would like to call as the third, the final wave or the sixth wave. But before that, let me just club all these five trajectories and milestones into three different clusters. The one is the 1970s to 1990s war. They provided a kind of a paradigm, and that paradigm was the journey from positivism to constructivism. So the first one I talked about. And the second and third tendencies, the post-positivism, post-structuralism, and the previous interpretivism, those two were probably clubbable or clusterable around the 1990s to 2005 era. This is the time when constructivists and criticalists were trying to debate within themselves, and there was a lot of debate not between qualitative and quantitative researchers, but within qualitative research itself. Questions were being raised about the compatibility and purity of paradigms. Some of them were saying, no, qualitative research should not use any of quantitative technologies, quantitative methods, methodologies. So the techniques of quantitative research should not corrupt qualitative research. So the purity of qualitative paradigm was promoted and actively advocated by one group of researchers within the qualitative framework. But there was another group of people who said, no, it is possible to think of a mixed mode of research, a kind of a triangulation where one can use all possible tools and methodologies and achieve a better description of social reality. So it is very much possible that we can think of a compatibility between qualitative and quantitative research. So this was the debate that was happening between critical theory, post-structuralists, interpretivists. That was the one that happened between that particular time. So it's also something that influenced many of our research agendas and our research practices in India as well. But today, we all know that that was also the period in the second wave, or the second war was also the period social science research was also becoming increasingly apolitical to a large extent. Okay, then came the current phase, 2005 to present. Here, as I've already elaborated, the re-emergence, the increasing ascendancy of evidence-based methodologies and mixed methods, the kind of a war between these two is emerging. The mixed method as a very successful method emerged in the second war as a victor. The second wave produced a particular kind of methodology called mixed methodology as a triumphant methodology, but this methodology is being questioned by evidence-based methodologies of the current stature. So the reassertion of technological rationality is another important challenge, another important tendency of the current times. So we are now increasingly seeing that more, as I talked about, the ontologies of number, the ontologies of counting is beginning to reassert themselves against the mixed methods. Because the very fundamental weakness of the mixed methods, which the second war between qualitative and within qualitative research produced, was something that actually opened up the space for these scientists to again come in and talk about numbers here. Okay. So the third tendency is something that we need to engage ourselves within. So I'm actually doing a bit of a kind of a daisy cutter, kind of a chain kind of an analysis where I talked about 5 phases, elaborated on the 5th phase by clustering all of them into 3 different wars. But now I'm going to talk about the tendencies within the final war, or the warring tendencies of today. And in the warring tendencies of today, what we see is the assertion of quantitative techniques becoming, wanting to become much more dominant here. Because the mixed method itself was something that resulted at one point in time where the quantitative methods and tools became the dominant method and other methods were pushed to the background. Even now, whenever I go around universities and talk to people, or when I see researchers interact with them in different seminars, I see a kind of an apology for not including qualitative research, but more often than not including it as an afterthought after having collected quantitative data. So the quantitative data becomes the horse, whereas the qualitative data becomes the cart. So the horse is pulling the cart rather than the other way around, or rather than even thinking of a kind of an equal space here. So what we have here is an apologetic inclusion of qualitative research, or even those people who do qualitative research in a very unabashed manner, in a very no-nonsense manner, they also tend to feel that their research is very weak and try to add numbers so that it can look a little more attractive, because that's the kind of language that sells. So I personally, when I went about training my researchers, either in development sector or in academic sector, I used to help these individuals and researchers to fight shy of this inferiority complex about having to only use qualitative research. So, but what happened was that our own weakness, our own apologies, our own shyness to fully commit ourselves to qualitative research without being antagonists to quantitative research has resulted in the reassertion of quantitative techniques in current times. So the tendency within that also has radical tendency. So the new kind of a method is, some people are probably declaring the war is over by talking about a new mixed methodology where quantitative research is becoming dominant. But there is also a tendency within this new age, the current contemporary war, where there is some possibility for a radical position to be taken also. And this radical position also entails another important challenge or another important possibility or a tendency called post-human and post-materialist moment. So the last phase, 2005 to today, has three tendencies within them, and radical position and post-human, post-materialist position, which is more triggered by neoliberalism and digitalism, is also there. Okay, so I'll just see what are these tendencies trying to do and what are they trying to foreground as they are trying to gain dominance within this war. Who's going to be the winner? Who's going to be the triumphant victor? So we'll see what are the different tendencies talking to us. The mixed method is trying to reassert or reconfigure research as a craft. Because 1980s, as the interpretivism and critical theories were trying to tell us that research is also a socially responsible, emancipatory exercise, the mixed methods of quantitative variety, the current tendencies, where the scientism and neoliberal digitalism is trying to dominate, is trying to tell us, let us just give up the whole idea of research as emancipatory, responsible exercise. We will not talk about sociology as social criticism or social research as action research. Social research is transformative. Let us just simply call research as a simple craft. Yes, you may use all kinds of artistry in it, but it's a craft. And this is also telling us the research, by consequence, has to become apolitical. There's no room for political orientation and political positioning. One has to be apolitical in research. And this mixed method continues to maintain the classical difference between the qualitative and quantitative research by saying they are incompatible. And this incompatibility between qualitative and quantitative research opens up the possibility of quantitative becoming once again a dominant mode of inquiring the social world than the qualitative social world. So instead of subjecting one another to the logic of one another, we are actually simply declaring that they're incompatible, so we'll abandon qualitative research altogether. That's another danger that could probably happen if we adhere to the first tendency. Now let us look at the second tendency and see which paradigm that we are going to choose as researchers, or at least we'll ask these questions when we engage in our own research. The radical position is fueled by global interpretive communities. It is all filled with all kinds of global interpretive communities. We already talked about how qualitative research community is now far and widely spread. Earlier, it was a marginal tendency even within Western universities, but not only did it become very dominant in Western universities, but also it's becoming dominant globally. So today we have a situation where more globally spread interpretive communities are available. I've already talked about German and Japanese, Korean, Argentinian, Brazilian, and Chinese, Indian qualitative research communities. India, we have the tendency, which is a bit weak here, but we do not have a registered qualitative research association or a registered qualitative kind of a journal, but all the other countries that I mentioned have very dynamic and active interpretive communities are there. And these interpretive communities are challenging the evidence-based scientism. And they have a lot of questions raised against evidence-based journalism, and they're trying to question them. And they are trying to reconfigure sociology and social research as political and moral engagements and not apolitical. And they question the very notion of evidence and the politics of that evidence. They are trying to unmask so that we can talk about social justice and promote it. And they're also talking about or advocating paradigm proliferation. Paradigm proliferation here is something that means that we need to really think about multiple paradigms rather than one single paradigm. But all these things, all this radicalism has to happen without becoming qualitatively over-romanticizing it. So in other words, we cannot suffer from qualitative ethicism. Many people do that, okay? They think, okay, since qualitative research is much more sensitive and humane, I'm ethically superior to other forms of research. That also we need to challenge. I'll quickly finish so that we will retain some time have some time for questions also. The final one, which is a very interesting and but kind of an enormous challenge in front of us, is the artificial intelligence offering us the scope that not only humans have agency, but also matters have agency. And how are we going to account for that? Can we have a qualitative research for matters with agency? If qualitative research is all about attributing and recognizing and celebrating human agency, what about the agency of the matter? What about the expansion of human into body, machine, animal, and material entanglement? Humans are no longer just confining themselves to human interaction, but also other kinds of interactions. And the role of biostatistics, particularly in pandemic times, each one is probably defining oneself in terms of biostatistics, how much counting of this particular element we have, this particular mineral, this particular corpuscles we have. We're also thinking in terms of oxygen level. So we are redefining our own sense of self in terms of numbers, which is also happening, which is also globally redefining our social situations and contexts. So it is in this situation that we need to really think about what is qualitative research and what kind of a paradigm I'm going to allow myself to be influenced by. Am I going to confine myself to the research as a craft kind of a paradigm, or am I going to think of myself as a research as a commitment and relationship? And that is a question that we need to ask very fundamentally. And it is in this context I would like to even propose the idea that we can even free ourselves from calling qualitative research as research, and even structure our relationship to qualitative inquiries as qualitative inquiry rather than research, because research still has the trappings of positivism, whereas inquiries mean more open-endedness, more ambiguity, more praxis, more liberation, more freedom, and more resistance here. And research is also a performance. So it is because it's a performance, we also have to act. And that act has to be an act by which we both, the researcher as well as the researched, rediscover our humanness and our aliveness. And that's what good research is all about. I have a few more slides, but for want of time, I can just comment on it during the discussion portion.